Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
I said, but I'm a Jew. And he said, wonderful. We have no Jews in Troy, Illinois. They all come to look at you. Indeed.
Charles Klotzer fled the Holocaust, only to end up a newspaper reporter in the unlikely location of Troy, Illinois, working for future Senator Paul Simon.
We stayed actually a lifelong relationship.
I'm Sarah Fensky. This is St. Louis on the Air. Charles Klotzer's passion for journalism ultimately led him to begin the St. Louis Journalism Review in 1970. Like many of the media watchdog publications that sprouted up at that time, it was inspired by the mainstream media's coverage of protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, coverage that seemed determined to cast false light on the protesters. The St. Louis Review, though, differs from many of those organizations in one key way. It's still going strong today. In fact, earlier this week, the publication, now titled the Gateway Journalism Review, celebrated its 50th anniversary with an event on Zoom featuring Judy Woodruff of the PBS NewsHour. And as for its founder, Charles Klotzer is still going strong today at 95, which is just one remarkable fact in a life that's been full of them. And he joins us today to talk about his passion for this work and the publication he founded. Charles Klotzer, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us on air.
We're excited to talk about this, and we're also joined today by Rita Chapo-Sweet. She's an associate professor of communications at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and she made a documentary about the Gateway Journalism Review and its founders more than a decade ago. It's titled Who's Minding the Media? Charles Klotzer and the St. Louis Journalism Review. So, Rita Chapo-Sweet, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back.
So, Rita, your film about this journalism review, it's well worth a watch years after its premiere. What made you think that Charles and Rose Klotzer would be a good subject for a film?
Well, let me just quickly correct you. I'm a media studies associate professor in the Honors College. But anyway, at UMSL. But because I was in media, I became interested in local media, local productions, and I had the chance at some point, I think it was in the mid 1990s, to meet with Charles, and I, after meeting Charles and Rose, I just fell in love with both of them. They were such a wonderful couple as a couple, but also I felt that what they were doing was so important to essentially have the job of really overseeing and keeping the media not just honest, but maintaining its integrity. And so I met with them many times, became, I guess, an advisor to the Journalism Review, and then I decided that this would be a wonderful opportunity to make, they would be perfect subjects for a documentary. And we began the documentary, I would say, in the early 2000s.
Okay. Now, Charles, I want to talk to you about your life, which the documentary gets into. And boy, it just made me curious to know even more. I understand you'd already fought your share of battles by the time you arrived in St. Louis. You were born in Germany. Your family fled the Third Reich for Shanghai. You were there nearly 10 years. How did you finally get to the U.S.?
Well, earlier, it was difficult to go to any country because most countries didn't want refugees from Europe. Mm-hmm. So it was closed. And Shanghai was a unique situation. While it was part of it occupied by Japanese, there were also British and French enclaves where British and French law were enforced. And the Western powers who ruled Shanghai didn't want the Japanese to be able to say anything about who comes and who goes. So they eliminated all visas, all paperwork, and when you go to Shanghai, you just went off the boat, there you were. And about nearly between 18 or 20,000 people took advantage of it and fled heavily from Germany and Austria and so others, and went to Shanghai because it was the only locality they could go to. So that's where we arrived in 1939 and stayed there, obviously, through the war. And then in late in 47, we got a visa to the United States, and we arrived in States. And of course, we arrived in San Francisco, and at that time had to decide where to settle. And we thought sort of St. Louis is in the center of the country. If we don't like it, we can get away. But I got stuck.
So there was any number of places you could go from St. Louis. That was its appeal?
Well, yes. They gave me several options. I knew enough about the South that I didn't want to settle there. And that on Pittsburgh and other areas, all we knew about is windows and coal industry, and breathing wasn't too good. In St. Louis, we didn't hear anything negative. So we went to St. Louis.
So you ended up in St. Louis, and it was quite a stroke of luck because it was here that you got hired for your first journalism job. And what's amazing is the person who hired you was Paul Simon, the future senator from Illinois. How did that come about?
Well, the job I had I didn't care for, so I put an ad in the Post-Dispatch looking for a job in journalism. And there was this young fellow from Troy, Illinois, who was wanted. He was 19. And we met downtown in St. Louis. And I told him my views, which were quite liberal. I haven't grown up. I'm still, if not more so. And he said, great, I like your views. I said, but I'm a Jew. And he said, wonderful. We have no Jews in Troy, Illinois. They all come to look at you. Indeed, as a matter of fact, they came. And I stayed there till I was drafted. At the same time, Paul was drafted. And then I left the Troy Tribune. But we stayed actually a lifelong relationship. And he had been of great support of various efforts I've had. And by the way, it's a whole different story. Senator Paul Simon was an amazing person, unusual.
Yeah, he does. He seems like quite a guy. And Rita, he's there in your documentary talking about back when he knew Charles Klotzer. That's a pretty good score right there.
Absolutely.
And in this documentary, it's really focused on the St. Louis Journalism Review. And this is something, Charles, that you started with your wife, Rose. Now, she died last year at the age of 90, but she is captured there in Rita's documentary.
We would put the kids to bed and go back downstairs and work. It was 16-hour days, and there was always things to do. Fortunately, I never kept a spick and span house or felt it was necessary.
Charles, she obviously prioritized the work over cleaning the house, and good for her. How did you and Rose first meet?
Well, we both went to Washington University, and in a student event, I asked her for a date, and we met. And after a couple of months, I was quite sure what I wanted to do, and asked her to marry me. And she said, no, I want to go to school. I'm not. Well, I'm pretty stubborn. 5 years later, I did marry her.
It took 5 years. Did you come back repeatedly during that time, or you waited 5 years and then asked again?
I had degrees. I went also to graduate school. But that time, one of my teachers and became friends, Merle Klink there. Then I said, well, I want to do something else. I'm going to go on. He said, you never finish your degree if you don't stay here. Well, I felt I could do it, but he was right. I never. At that time, you could skip your master's if you go for a PhD. Well, I never got it. I got too busy with life. And as a result of my studies there, I got very much involved with some of the people who were my teachers, Tom Elliott and Merle Kling and so on. But the journalism review, which I started in 1960, no, it was Focus Midwest 62. Journalism was in 1970, which I started because there were so many things going on which I felt the public should know about. Whereas first issue, for example, we had a whole story about the joint operating agencies. Probably many people don't know what it means. It means that the two or more papers within one community have joint operations about everything except for news and editorial. That happened with the Globe and Post. They're jointed. And we published in the first issue, and I got a call from one of the editors at the Post said, "You're libeling us. We are separate." All I could tell them is all we did, Pulitzer testify before the U.S. Senate committee about the operation, and we just copied what Pulitzer revealed that time. And that joint operating agency was taken advantage of by the Post and Globe. Then ultimately the Globe closed because Newhouse, who was the owner of the Globe, was offered 50% of the profits of the Post. And they were closed. And Newhouse couldn't turn away the offer of 50%. So the Globe was closed. Although the Globe at that time had more circulation than the Post had. That's just one of them. There's so many other things. That story, by the way, was researched and we published in the Post that time. He was a co-editor, Roland Close, who worked on that story. And there were so many other things, like the suburban newspapers had a rule that no African American should be featured above the fold on the front page.
Wow.
And young African Americans who assembled downtown, socializing usually around midnight and so on, which businesses downtown don't like, having all these young people around. So the police assigned their own patrol cars to corral the cars which were traveling on towards the highway. And they locked all the highways except in the suburbs. And they felt once all these cars on suburbs, they won't come back. That's another story we revealed. And when we confronted the police commissioner about it, he sort of pretended not to know about all these things. I mean, I can give you so many different stories.
Yeah, I mean, you guys were really publishing some stuff that was the talk of the town. I mean, this was some groundbreaking journalism here. And Rita, as you cover in your film, they were also publishing a strike newspaper for a while when the journalists at the mainstream papers went on strike.
Yes, I wanted to mention that. It's essentially it's typical of the way the journalism review worked and the way Rose and Charles worked. There was a strike. The Post-Dispatch went on strike and basically laid off all their reporters and their editors. And Charles decided, well, we have all these journalists that are not working. We'll create the St. Louis. I believe it was the St. Louis Times, Charles, isn't that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so for the duration of the strike, the Post-Dispatch reporters and editors were working for Charles. So you had this situation, which is historically huge. I think that is enormous. One of the biggest papers, because in those days St. Louis Post-Dispatch was among the top 10, was being published out of a U City basement in the house of this couple, and and essentially, eventually the strike was settled and the reporters went back. But that's something that nobody knows about, and yet it's so important for St. Louis history to recognize people who at their own expense and at their own interest or communal interest were doing an act like this there was no financial benefit in it whatsoever, but it was the right thing to do, and professionally it was really very important.
We're talking today to Rita Chapo-Sweet. She is a professor of media studies at the University of Missouri St. Louis and has a documentary that came out back in the aughts that's still very relevant today. Who's Minding the Media? Charles Klotzer and the St. Louis Journalism Review. That today is the Gateway Journalism Review. It just celebrated its 50th anniversary. We're here with its founder, Charles Klotzer, as well. And Rita, your film gets into the headwinds that media reviews like the St. Louis Journalism Review faced in the 1970s. You interviewed Ed Bishop. He's the late professor. He worked at Webster University and was editor of this publication for years. And here's what he told you about that time period in the 70s.
In the 70s, they hit on hard times. First of all, like many of the alternative newspapers of that era, few of them lasted, because they were geared mainly to two things, the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. And when both of those things either cooled off or went away entirely, they had trouble readjusting their editorial focus. But their biggest problem, of course, was financial. And none of them were able to survive financially, with the exception of the St. Louis Journalism Review. It's the only one of those journalism reviews founded in the late 60s that still exists. And the only reason it still exists is because Charles underwrote it. He, out of his own pocket, paid for it for 25 years.
And that is the late Ed Bishop, as featured in Who's Minding the Media. Now, Charles, you were in your 70s when you reached out to area universities to see if they would consider taking this publication under their wing. I know it first went to Webster. That's where Ed Bishop worked on it. How did it end up at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, which is where it is today?
Yeah, well, in 95, I was getting older, better look around. Who knows what's going to happen? So Professor Don Corrigan at Webster made it possible, talking the executive there into accepting the review. And from about 95 to 2005, like Ed Bishop, who talked, you heard right now, became a teacher there, as well as the main and editor of the review. And in 2005, Webster said they're too broke to continue. They didn't subsidize it as much, but whatever it was too much for them. So in 2005, it came back to me. But there was so much support in the community, which helped keep it alive till about 2010. Meanwhile, many of reporters and editors who were let go by the Post and other publications. Many went to SIU Carbondale, including Bill Freivogel, who became the professor and head of the journalism department there. And I talked to him. He liked the idea. It took quite some effort on his part to have SIU Carbondale to accept the review. And because of him, the review is still alive. And in 2010, finally, they accepted it about 10 years ago. And Freivogel, who's now the publisher, frankly, does hell of a job in keeping it going. And it was just because he and others who had to look for different ways to keep busy. He was also one of them who went to SIU Carbondale.
And so
that's
it's now spent a decade there. Rita, I know you're on the board of advisors there.
Yes.
How do you feel to know that this journalism review is still going strong? As you said in your documentary that premiered in 2004, at the time, so many of these, all the others had gone away, and yet this one was still ticking. It's still ticking today. It just published an issue.
It is, and And it's, I mean, I think the people who are still involved with it are doing a wonderful job. I mean, if you just think of the contribution to local and regional journalism education, there are students who have been trained by the St. Louis Journalism Review and then are now, more students working with the Gateway Journalism Review. But I think the most important thing is it's almost a bit ironic that that things have sort of come full circle. There was a time, yes, in the 70s when there were journalism reviews, and there were a number of them. But then over the years, there was the media became more and more constricted. They were the papers and the other broadcast stations and so on were being held in fewer and fewer hands, to the point where it almost destroyed local news at all. And the interesting thing, I think, is with the pandemic, and Judy Woodruff brought it home to me when we had the interview with her this past week, that now national journalists and international journalists are basically at home. I mean, a lot of people can't move and they can't travel the way they used to. And so, as I said, ironically now, it's going to be the local journalists and the local reporters and media outlets like KWMU that are going to be able to really honestly and clearly present local issues. So I just think it's interesting that, we've come around, and hopefully there will be now more democratic journalism, and it'll hopefully breathe new life into journalist reviews like Gateway Journalism Reviews.
I hope you're right about that. And Charles, for our last question here, I do want to bring it back to you. This publication's still going strong. That's something to be proud of. What do you see your legacy as you look back on all the work that you've done in this field?
Well, one of the things I should mention, yes, my wife Rose and I was obviously, in a way, triggering and involved. There were so many others who helped and co-founded. Ted Guest was one of the key people, the late Roy Malone, Peggy Carlin. There were so many others who helped keep it going and, be involved. And the idea of journalism review, a brief note, goes back. Actually, the original is George Seldes, who in World War I had in fact published, and he revealed that tobacco kills people. And he also revealed that the New York Times had an agreement with the tobacco industry to keep their advertising as long as they're not critical of smoking or tobacco.
And so there's a long history here of these watchdogs doing amazing work, and I know that the St. Louis Journalism Review and the Gateway Journalism Review fits right into that, and we are honored to celebrate that with you today. So Charles Klotzer, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
And Rita Chapo-Sweet, thank you so much for joining us today as well.
Thank you.
If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.